is, what kind of school do you teach or work at? Emily, are you able to load that poll for us? Great. So in the list that you see there, if you can pick the school that best describes the school where you teach or work, if none of them are appropriate, just go for the other category. And maybe then if you type other, maybe you can let us know in the chat what type of school you're at, how you would describe it. Have we got all of the answers in? Okay, there we see. So lots of you working at K-12 schools where English is taught as a subject, a few people in international schools, quite a few in bilingual schools. That's interesting. Some of you universities, some private language schools. For the people who said other, how would you describe the school that you're working in? Do we have any responses there, Ian? Secondary school at a private college, I can see here.
Right, a lot of different things coming in.
Yeah, a lot of variants. So we've got a really nice mix here of people from different educational backgrounds.
State school, seeing state school coming in.
And state schools too, and Catholic private schools and other religious schools. Yeah, great. Well, welcome today, and I'm sure there's going to be lots that you find interesting in the research that we're going to present to you and the trends that we're going to be looking at today, no matter what your context is. So the plan for today is that we're going to examine some of the changes or macro trends that we and many experts in the field are seeing in English language instruction worldwide. Because in 2021, we conducted a research project to understand how those macro trends were having an impact on educational institutions and on the school leaders, teachers, and students that are working within them. And our goal today is to review those changes or macro trends and to connect that to our research project. And we want to share the key findings from our research project and what we think the implications will be from those findings on educators. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Ian, who's going to talk you through some of those macro trends.
Can you click just click again, Rachel?
Oh, click again. Yeah.
That's it. Perfect. Thank you. So we'd like to start by just reviewing the modern world. This is the modern world before recent disruption. This was what was happening in a single day on planet Earth a couple of years ago. You know, these are big numbers and you can read them, so I'm not going to read them to you. In the last 30 to 40 years, there has been a lot of movement across borders and especially into cities. More people have access to education and a higher standard of living than ever. COVID has interrupted this trend for the moment. But we've also learned that during the pandemic, it was possible for the world to remain connected virtually in many different ways using different types of technology. It's uncertain right now how much we will revert back to a pre-2020 state. You know, we're seeing all kinds of things happening in the world. For example, you know, supply chain and so on. But this level of connectedness and the ways in which people from different regions, different countries, different cities are able to communicate is also forcing the role of English to evolve in the world. English really is now the global language of communication. It's used by hundreds of millions, maybe a billion or more people daily to communicate with one another. And more people are speaking it at younger ages with a high level of proficiency. We also see, and one of the macro trends is more and more people who are acquiring their education partly or wholly in English, often in the private sector, often with an international curriculum of some kind. But those people may actually be people based locally in a country where they speak a different language, where they go home and speak a different language, where they leave the classroom and speak a different language, but their education or some of their education is going to be in English. And the goal could be to study overseas, it could be to get a better job, it could be to become bilingual or highly proficient in English. There are many reasons, but this trend we have seen growing greatly. Next slide, please, Rachel. And just a quick snapshot of some of the things I've seen. So when I started teaching back in the late 80s, I'll be honest, it was 1989, which ages me right out of college, and into the 90s. People were shooting to get a first certificate qualification. That was the goal. That was, I have that, and that gives me an advantage. I can get a better job. Most of that English was acquired in private language schools, some kind of private sector institute where you paid money after your state school or after work or before work in some cases. English was taught in some public, state, K-12 countries in some grades, mostly high school. Some schools began at middle school, depending on which part of the world you're in, but most students didn't really learn English in school until they got to high school. And there was a real divide between the native and the non-native speakers of the language. And the private K-12 was for a few people, mostly international schools for expats. Now, if you look on the right-hand side in the 2020s where we are, I mean, I could go through these points, but the main point to make is more and more people have higher levels of English because English is a requirement, because there are so many different ways to learn it, because they have access in their daily lives through the internet and through work and through study and through popular culture. And so we have more and more multilingual learners, people who are not speaking English as their first language, but they are using it regularly. They're using it for work, for study, for social reasons, and they're using it daily, becoming highly proficient and very fluent and very communicative in the language. And associated with this, we've also seen a great growth in what we would call private K-12. So this could be international schools, but it could also be bilingual schools or some kind of school in the K-12 area where parents pay for their children to get an education. And often that is now partly or wholly in English. Next slide, please, Rachel. Just a bit of background into what we've been doing as a publishing house. We are a publishing house. We've been working with Noni Lasso, who is the academic dean at Harvard Graduate School of Business. She is the professor of education and society. She works with us as a consultant too on some of our materials. Her focus is supporting language and literacy development. And she's an important person in shaping our approach and the direction we take in materials for these multilingual learners of English. I'm going to take you through a couple of sort of pieces of information that we've worked on her with. So let's click to the next box. Next. Thank you. So about 20 years ago, I was living in Hong Kong, and I used to work a little bit with some of the international schools there. Hong Kong had a lot of them. They were mostly for expatriate children, parents who had been sent or were working overseas and needed to give their children an education in English. They could come from over 100 different countries, but it was private, it was international in some way, and the children were largely learning the curriculum in English. There were about 1,000 of these. Moving forward to today, 2021, in fact, or 2018, but these numbers, we still look at the ISC research, and these numbers are pretty much the same. There are about 8,000 international schools. Now, as I said, they're not all international. Some of these you could call bilingual or some other form of private. The number of students, well, it's 4.5 million. That's significant. But the most important piece of information, I think, here is that 80% of these students actually come from the school's host country. For instance, if the school is an international or bilingual school in Vietnam, 80% or more of those students are local Vietnamese children. They're not expatriate children. There might be some expatriates. We spoke to schools in our research where there were Korean children in an international school. There were children from Egypt. There were children from Brazil. But a lot of what we were seeing was in this new growth of schools, a lot of the students were local or expatriate from countries and backgrounds where they did not speak English as a first language. And we expect this trend to continue. Next, please, Rachel. You can see the numbers. They're expected to almost double 10 years from now. I think there are many reasons for this. You can talk about parents wanting to give their children an advantage and put them into a private school, the advantage of being proficient or bilingual in English, the ability to go overseas and study at a prestigious university in English, the Perhaps the local government is not providing the right level of education for the parents. Maybe the government is doing the opposite and in fact wants to develop local skills, and they see a private sector school system which does international qualifications as the way to develop those skills in the country to help grow the economy. So there's a lot of different reasons for this, but this is a trend, and we're seeing an impact on English, which we're going to talk about later. Next, please. So we've established there are millions of students. They want to achieve academic success in English, and they have a very diverse background. But the needs that they are starting to require are also changing. Next, please, Rachel. I've put this in a red box so you don't miss it. It's not just that they are getting a different type of education, it's that the world is looking for new skills. And today's youth are it's not just English as a subject. They need English to be able to do specific things. Part of it's advanced literacy and communication. Of course, they need this in their mother tongue as well. But things that employers are looking for, things that national governments are looking for: critical thinking, problem solving, collaborating with others, being able to work with people from other cultures, things that we would call competencies or skills. Some are hard skills like basic programming, others are soft. For example, intercultural communication, or collaborating with others, or being able to make presentations to groups. These are things that we increasingly see. And I think we acknowledge that, next, Rachel, in the types of curriculum and the types of materials that are needed to support these needs of parents, of students, of schools, and of national governments and employers. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of slides where we talk about that last piece, the needs of governments and employers. This is from a report from a couple of years back. The main point to make is the implication for education. A new kind of graduate. What is this new kind of graduate? Well, mostly it's the type of skills that they need. Globalization is part of driving those new skills, but there's also the digital revolution, as I said, soft skills and hard skills, and just the uncertainties and changes in the world. And employers and national governments are increasingly looking for certain types of citizen and employees. Next, please. Let's take a quick look. This is from a report from MIT. I'm not going to read all the stuff, just make the point that the world of work has changed a lot. What kind of things are employers looking for is largely determined by the types of jobs that are being created. And one statistic this report from MIT on the future of work, or work of the future, made is that in 1940, 63% of the jobs that we now have had not even been invented or created or needed. On the left, you can see the year. This is a survey they've done every 10 years. In the middle, you can see the types of jobs that were new in that year. So in 1940, being an automatic welding machine operator was a new job. I think perhaps automatic was the piece. And that's a job that requires technical skills. On the right was a job that's softer. I kind of like the job. You've got a welder on one side and a gambling dealer. I think this is obviously the growth of a place like Las Vegas. But on the middle column, those jobs tend to require more technical skills. As you go down the list up to 2018, there are jobs in things that require information technology, solar and wind power, engineering, design, installation, and so on, and new medical specialities like pediatric vascular surgeon. And on the right, they require softer skills. You have a gambling dealer going to a drama therapist. The world's become more specialized. I think the jobs on the right are no less important, as the jobs in the middle tend to be better paid. They obviously have money to spend, and they need the people on the right-hand columns, sommeliers in restaurants, chat room hosts, conference planners, to throw that money at. But this is just a snapshot of the world of work, and it reflects the needs of people in a changing world. And of course, they need different skills. Next slide, please. this is from another survey from the World Economic Forum, and it's from the Center for the New Economy and Society. These are skills that employers value. This is from a 2018 report. I want you in chat to put in what you think the skills employers value would be for 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Just guess what you think they would be in chat. Put them up in chat. Critical thinking. Okay, we're seeing critical thinking. Working in groups, flexibility, social skills, teamwork, creativity, communication, hard work. I love that one. Encoding, discipline. I like that too. Artificial intelligence, negotiation. Wow, there's a lot. Yep, collaboration, cognitive abilities, flexibility, leadership, lots of things. Thank you. This is really good. Let's show the top 5, Rachel. There we go. You got most of them. Problem solving, critical thinking, people management. You can call that leadership, though it might also be getting people to work together. Collaboration, coordinating with others. It's sort of range of things, kind of very different to the type of work we looked at, say, 20, 30 years ago. This is what employers are saying we need graduates to be able to do when they start work with us. And most of these particular skills are associated with higher levels of education. And, you know, increasingly, the education that develops these skills begins in primary school. And again, this is sort of where the private K-12 schools spend a lot of their time, developing project work, the ability to work with other people, how to think critically, how to solve problems, how to be creating things. This is very much tied into the growth in private education. If parents feel the public system does not provide this type of skill that employers need, and the high-paid jobs provide, or even high-paid jobs, just interesting jobs provide, then they will send their children, if they can, to places that do provide them with those skills. These are mostly soft skills, but absolutely you're correct. Computational thinking, coding, all those things are important. Next slide, please. So this is from yet another report from McKinsey, the consulting company. And the main point I want to make is that there are organizations that have analyzed it. And this is actually run out of their public and social sector part of the business. This is really what national governments are saying is needed. They broke down the world of work into 4 main dimensions: cognitive, interpersonal, and 2 others I've completely forgotten right now, but we'll show you in a second. And then they broke that down into sub-skills like critical thinking, communication, mental flexibility, and under that, sub-skills on things that citizens would need to do to be good citizens and to be able to contribute to the world of work in a national or regional economy. You can see the types of things here are very similar to the previous slide and the previous slide. Structured problem solving, good communication of different types, being able to negotiate, being able to work in a team, being able to empower people. Could you click again, Rachel? Into things like self-leadership and digital literacy, coding. This is a good report. I've provided the reference at the bottom. But this is what national governments are saying they need their citizens to be able to do. And again, parents are looking at how can I prepare my children and my children for this world. Next slide, please. And finally, before we get into the research, PISA is also looking at this. Back in 2014, a group of academics wrote a letter to PISA and saying there's a danger in overemphasizing academic skills only. It's only part of the story. If you wish to truly reflect what students need and to measure it, you need to include something which they're calling, and which they launched in 2018, something called global competence, which looks at a range of different things, from being able to talk about and understand global issues, to being able to communicate, look at other people's perspectives, and finally take action. So this is sort of another reflection of how the world of work, the world of employers, national governments, parents are changing the way in which students are prepared for their future. And to reinforce that, a lot of this in the private school system, private K-12, and increasingly universities, is taking place in English, or some of it is taking place in English. Okay, Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Ian. And Ian has really given us this kind of very rounded perspective of the types of trends that have been driving the external forces, really, that have been influencing educational policy and also curricula. And what we really wanted to do with the research that we conducted in spring last year was to get a deeper understanding of how these trends are playing out within schools in different locations around the world. So we wanted to see how teachers are interpreting these trends for themselves and how they're integrating them into the school curriculum, and what that meant really for the educational experiences of learners, and also for the expectations that it's placing on teachers. And then we wanted to take all of that, those findings, and reflect back on how we, as educational publishers, could support the aspirations of teachers and learners and the institutions they work in, and how we could help them overcome some of the challenges that we'd identified in affecting these changes. So here you can see, catch up with myself now, and you can see distill down the goals for our research. Okay, and here you can see how the kind of spread of the different countries that we interacted with over the course of this research. And it feels like I was going to ask you at this point where you're located in the world, but I can see that lots of you have already typed that into the chat. So I'm not going to ask you now. Thanks for sharing with us where you're located around the world. It's great to see so many different places represented. When we set out on this research, we agreed that it was important for us to get a really meaningful sense of what matters to educators around the world that we spoke to, and what they're trying to achieve and why those things are important to them. So we decided that the best way we could get a really in-depth and rounded picture of this was to speak to them, was to conduct in-depth interviews with leaders and classroom teachers at these schools, to get a sense of what kinds of skills and resources they have to draw on to achieve the goals that they're trying to meet, what kind of unmet needs that they had, so that we could see where we could provide support. And so we conducted 67 interviews in total. These are quite long interviews, are between an hour and a half. As I said, most of them were with educators, often in leadership positions, things like principals and academic heads and coordinators, all in K-12 institutions. And we also conducted interviews with our own colleagues who regularly visit these schools, so that we could benefit from their knowledge and the interactions they'd had with teachers on the ground. And we wanted to focus our attention on the institutions that were really leading the charge in terms of the transition that Ian's just described. So institutions that were starting to shift their focus from the kind of ELT that we saw 20 years ago that treated English as a kind of foreign language subject, and that was mostly focused on achieving a kind of desired level of proficiency, maybe to pass local exams, to what we wanted to look at really was schools that were looking at equipping students with English as a lingua franca, and maybe taking a more holistic view of the types of skills that students might need to become successful communicators, and really thinking about English, the fact that we live in this globally interconnected world, and what types of life skills and more intangible type of skills that students might need for this. So what we translated that into in terms of the profile of the schools that we would look at, we decided that this probably meant mostly, but not in all cases, private institutions, that these schools would be offering mainstream education right from preschool or kindergarten through to high school, that most of these schools would have goals that were probably higher than the kind of average in the country that they found themselves to be in. They were quite aspirational in nature. That those schools would be delivering some or all of the curriculum in English, and this was a real patchwork. Some of the schools we spoke to were maybe just doing 1 or 2 subjects in English, as well as actually English instruction itself, And some of the schools were delivering their whole curriculum in English, 100% in English. And what we saw also was that these schools were often in a very sort of competitive environment in relation to other institutions with a similar provision where they found themselves. And the goals of these institutions were very much focused on the kinds of higher education institutions that the students would be able to access when they left the school, which was often quite prestigious institutions in the home country, or in many cases also higher education institutions abroad. And these schools were also seeking to prepare students for an internationally facing career. So a career in which, thinking specifically about English instruction, that they would be likely to be using English to connect with and communicate with and interact with people whose first language may not be, in many cases, English, and they would be navigating lots of different cultural contexts, different from their own background. So again, what this means for English is that you have to then look at English beyond being an academic subject. It becomes a lingua franca. And as such, it's also a passport to a premium education at university level. And it was also very much perceived as contributing to a better quality of life. And the English lessons in themselves were often used as a vehicle to acquire other values and skill sets. So there's a heavy kind of load of expectations on what would happen in the English classroom too, in terms of the types of skills and competencies that teachers would be able to develop. And something that emerged very clearly from our interviews is that within this K-12 space, we can really find an eclectic set of schools and needs. And as you can see from this slide, our research took in a broad range of institutions. So if you look at the spectrum at the top in terms of size, setup capabilities, and educational quality. However, despite the differences in the types of resources schools had to draw on, and on their levels of ambition in terms of the curricula and the educational outcomes that they aspired to, we saw that there was more that united than divided them. They had more in common than differences. And we saw some very similar aspirations emerging, and also some very similar challenges. And I think it is useful to think of this educational landscape as a spectrum or a continuum, with different institutions placing at different points along the continuum. And where any given institution is at this specific point in time isn't static. It's not necessarily going to stay the same. By its very nature, this private K-12 aspirational space is a mobile space. It's very dynamic in terms of a market space. So I think that this is, where somebody sits at any particular point where an institution sits is really just a snapshot in time. And many of the institutions we spoke to, teachers were working towards expanding their English provision and improving their educational outcomes in the mid to long term. And some of them were even planning to switch to an international curriculum or preparing towards accreditation. And we're going to share our research findings with you today under two main headlines: goals and challenges. And we're going to focus on the goals and challenges that were most commonly shared across the geographies and institution types that we encountered. And we'll examine them one by one and consider what that means specifically for English language instruction. And I hope that that's going to give you an opportunity too to reflect on what it means for you as an educator and for the learners that you teach. We'll also ask you periodically to share your reflections and experiences as we move through this next section. So on to goal one, schools want to integrate English more deeply into the curriculum, and that in many cases this may mean adopting a bilingual or international curriculum. Goal two will be looking at how the types of learning outcomes that schools focus on and which types of skills and competencies they need to equip students with to reach them. Goal three will be looking at global mindset. The priority of many schools is to prepare students to study overseas or to work in an international context. And then on to the challenges, where I'll hand back to Ian. We'll be looking at those difficulties with implementing the curriculum that's been chosen and achieving the objectives that they've set themselves. And we'll be looking at variances in student and teacher competency and how that affects some schools' ability to implement their chosen curriculum. And just as a quick preface, you'll be seeing as I move through and talk about the different schools, reference to quite a range of different curriculum types. Are these familiar to you? Do any of you, could you type in the chat for me, do any of you follow any of the curricula that you can see listed here? And so we've got UK oriented, Cambridge, so there's a few people that follow Cambridge, UK oriented, and US. Yep. Lots of Cambridge and US and UK here. Oh, a couple of IBs. The IB people are piping up now too. Great. That's really interesting to see. So this data that you can see on this slide is taken from the ISC data from 2021. And these are the numbers of institutions officially following these different curricula. And you can kind of see the trends. I mean, there's been a huge growth, particularly in following the Cambridge curriculum, and a more gentle curve upwards for international baccalaureate and UK and US oriented curriculum. And this might not take into account also the many schools that we encountered in our research that were actually unofficially following a curriculum or creating a bespoke curriculum that was inspired by one or more of these curricula. And that was a phenomenon that we encountered quite a lot in our research. So just for anybody who isn't familiar with these curricula, the UK oriented curriculum most commonly means the English national curriculum. And the US curriculum that we see most commonly in use is the Common Core. So when you see reference to the Common Core, we're talking about the US oriented curricula. Whoop, I have accidentally shot ahead. I'm going to go back a little bit here. So a little bit of a description here for you to help with understanding what these different curricula mean. I'll give you a moment to have a look through those. Okay. So when school leaders are making decisions about which curricula to adopt, as well as thinking about educational outcomes and what they're aspiring to achieve, they also need to take into consideration the student profile. Who are their students? What's their starting point? What level of preparation do students start with? What support will they need to be able to achieve these educational outcomes? And I'm going to give you a moment to read through these quotes from 3 of the interviews that we undertook. One's from a head of a department at a bilingual school in Kuwait, the one you see here in the left. Another is from a teacher in an international school in Vietnam, and the other is from a coordinator at a school following the IB program in Mexico. And as you're reading through, I'm going to ask you to type in the chat, what do you notice about the students these teachers are talking about? And what does that tell you about the types of needs they might have? Great, Megan. Yeah, the students are locals, not expats. Yeah, and Mariam, there's a focus on fluency. Focus also on international culture. Why do you think that there is this focus on international culture? The students having a hard time, yeah. So that it's not an easy process necessarily switching towards an international curriculum. English literature is mentioned. So I think that what I took away from this is that, first of all, as Megan pointed out, most of these students aren't from the local population. And that was the case in probably the majority of the schools that we spoke to. In some cases, there was a smaller percentage, a minority of students who were international students from other countries, but generally speaking, most of the institutions we spoke to, the biggest part of the student body was local population. And that's a trend that the ISC have also commented on and observed over the last 5 to 10 years in particular. I think that what the teachers are also getting at here is that moving towards an international curriculum, they also need to be very attentive to the fact that the students, because English is not their L1, they need to ensure that, as well as having these ambitious goals that are part of an international curriculum, sometimes those international curricula don't always take into account the amount of language support that students need to attain those goals, and that they often found that they were backtracking and retrospectively trying to plug in language support to support their students in being able to access the curriculum, as well as developing the skills and competencies that those curricula require. And one of the interesting things was that schools often want to make the transition towards a bilingual curriculum in order to embed English more deeply into their curriculum and provide students with more exposure to the language, while schools that were adopting international curricula would often come into the realization that sometimes the complex demands of an international curriculum doesn't always take into account the language support needs of those non-L1 students, and then they were trying to plug that in retrospectively. And this brings us to the next finding. What are the kind of educational outcomes schools following bilingual programs or international curricula are aspiring to? What do you, I'm going to throw this question out to you. What do you think the kind of learning outcomes that bilingual and international curricular schools are aspiring to? Any thoughts? 21st century skills? Yeah, I think that did feature quite highly. Okay, so educational outcomes are really a key driver for which curriculum schools decided to adopt. And often these centre, as I mentioned before, around tertiary education or career aspirations. So the skills that they want students to acquire alongside language proficiency. And they often relate to academic skills that are going to grant students to access to prestigious universities or to employability. And in that case, you often see soft skills like life skills and global mindset, and some of the types of skills that Ian was talking about earlier on in the presentation. And regarding the means to achieve these aspirations, we saw educators adopting a wide variety of tools and pathways, and we saw more of a flexibility in approach than we'd anticipated, with some of the institutions fully adopting an international curriculum and adhering to it very closely, while others were just using the curriculum as inspiration to build their own bespoke curriculum that they felt more closely met their needs. So looking at some of these learning outcomes that we saw most frequently mentioned by the people we spoke to in our research, in the poll that has now popped up on your screens, can I ask you to choose the 2 of these educational outcomes that are most important to you for your learners? So just choose 2. And I think all of these here that you see are probably familiar from some of the things Ian talked about earlier. Do we have the results in of the poll, Emily? Have we got most people? There we go. Oh, English language proficiency still very important. We've got to remember what we're here to do in English language classroom. You know, the first base is to actually assimilate the language itself, but then very closely following, I think head to head, we've really got academic language skills and preparation and problem solving and critical thinking here. That's very interesting.
We're
With
seeing some comments
cross-curricular
in chat,
language,
Rach.
much less important.
We're
Sorry?
seeing some comments in chat that are sort of
Parental pressure.
exactly with things we heard during the research about parental pressure and so on.
Yeah, yeah. And parents, particularly at this sort of aspirational end of education, there's a phrase that I see used very often in the media in the UK currently, helicopter parenting. You know, it's this sense of, you know, parents being very closely involved and always wanting to know what's going on and requiring explanations from teachers. And I think you're more likely to see that kind of level of interest from parents at this aspirational end. I'm going to move on. And so I think that this teacher at a bilingual school in China articulated really well the type of learning outcomes that he looks to develop in his students, and how that links to their future lives and aspirations, both in and beyond the classroom. So academic aspirations, but also sort of personal and career focused aspirations. And he really gets at this concept of English as a tool for global communication, and this ability that they want to inculcate in students to navigate between a range of cultural contexts and have the communicative skills, not just for interaction in academic environments, but also for functional everyday language, so that they can manage everyday life in another country. I would go beyond that and say it's also about building relationships and building intercultural understanding. So it's clear that academic attainment and excellence is the ultimate goal for this institution, and that this head of department introduces the concept of academic literacy, a kind of working knowledge of the academic process and a kind of critical awareness of what constitutes high quality academic research. Does this feel familiar to many of you? Yeah, parental. I'm just reading through some of the comments. There we go. And what type of skills do we think help develop a global mindset as we move to this goal 3, which is a global mindset? Any ideas and any thoughts?
Intercultural skills.
Intercultural skills, yeah, would definitely have openness.
Oh, that's a good one. Logical thinking.
Openness, very important.
Different
and global mindset is generally taken to mean an openness towards other cultures and peoples, as well as the ability to adapt and navigate international environments, and to be equipped really with the kinds of soft skills that ensure that communication with people who might be from very different backgrounds to you goes smoothly. So in the minds of the educators we spoke to in this research, global mindset was kind of operating at a variety of different levels within an educational context. On the one hand, teachers were talking about global mindset as a principle that they wanted to see reflected in the learning materials that they use. And here we saw representation featuring very highly. They considered it important for student engagement that students saw people like themselves in the materials. Because as this director of curriculum in an international school following a US curriculum in Saudi Arabia explained, it brings to life a diverse and inclusive environment that kind of has the feeling of authenticity to students because it reflects the environment that they find themselves in. Teachers also felt that global mindset meant helping students to see the connection between the English they're learning in the classroom and the English that they would likely use in their future lives and careers. So they wanted to see in our materials interactions in international contexts and the kind of skills that might be deployed in such an environment, modelled for students. And some of the skills that teachers associated with global mindset were, as you've mentioned, interpersonal and intercultural skills like self-awareness, empathy, adaptability. And they also equated it to a kind of social confidence when operating in English. And we had teachers who spoke about students with academic high achievers who'd earned a place at a prestigious university abroad, but then they'd found themselves not able to make the most of the experiences and all the opportunities that it offered to them because they struggled to navigate social interaction in the host country and to adapt to the new environment. And that had made them really come to this realization that the development of a global mindset was really fundamental to helping students make the most of the opportunities life has to offer them. And as we start to talk about the challenges learners and educators face, I'm going to hand back to Ian so we can move to the next part of our findings.
Well, we have 2 challenges to get into. Of course, there are many more challenges than that, but you know, we have an hour, and we wanted to dilute and distill the main ideas into something which would be relevant to the people on this webinar. The first challenge was in implementing the curriculum, and for a range of reasons, schools are not always able to implement the curriculum in the way in which the curriculum is meant to be implemented, and therefore the students and the teachers are not necessarily able to achieve the goals of the curriculum that they've chosen, and they have to in some way change it or modify it or dilute it or focus on a small part of it. And, you know, again, this comes back, I think, to the rapid increase in the number of schools that are offering a private education in K-12. They grew very fast. We said that 20 years ago, there were 1,000 international schools. Most of those were international schools, expatriate students, expatriate teachers, high levels of English proficiency, lots of special needs resources to get students up to the level needed to take part in the curriculum, and so on. And then we said, now there are 8,000, and many of those have up to 80%, or in fact, over 80% in many cases. Someone on this webinar said 90% of their students are local, speaking the local language in most settings, even in the school, outside the classroom and at home, and in local community and society. So it's not easy to implement a curriculum in that context. We heard there were many reasons for the curriculum to be hard to implement. Inconsistency of language ability or skills from teachers and students. The way in which students were being asked to learn was very demanding. They came from perhaps a public school, which was very much rote learning, book learning, and they were asked to move into a school where they had to do projects and present and work with other people and do research, and they were just not used to that style. We're going to share the voice of some of the customers. Next slide, please, Rachel. The first one is in Vietnam. I've highlighted some of the key things. This teacher, you know, he's the principal. Even if you were teaching history or social studies or math, you had to be a language teacher. You know, obviously, all teachers need to be comfortable, even if they're not trained to do that. They need to be aware that students may have difficulty with a subject because of language. So this is a reality. This is a new reality for many schools. Next, Rachel, thank you. That the curriculum may not actually be accredited, and schools follow a curriculum. They don't necessarily follow it exactly. Some of it's for the benefit of parents. The parents want to see that their child is getting an international education of some kind because it's an international school or a bilingual school or has an international education system within the school in some way. But what is actually possible for the school is that they can only touch on certain parts of the curriculum. And I don't think that I'm critical of that. I think that's realistic, and it's actually a good way to develop students' skills in other areas. Just because your curriculum needs you to understand the American Civil War or the English Constitution, perhaps that's not useful. Maybe it's better for them to focus on skills and the skills through English, and that would be enough to get them where they need to go in life. And lastly, I need to shut the chat down so I can see this, that the curriculum might need modifying for a range of different reasons. It's too difficult. Perhaps the teachers are not comfortable with it. They're used to it in perhaps the United States, but when it's translated to an international or bilingual school in another country, the teachers are not used to the resources or how to work with them. It's just training, really. So there's a sort of a range of reasons. Now we're going to ask you the difficulties that you have. There's a poll, I think. Maybe we can launch the poll. There should be a poll coming. There we go. So I want you to choose a single choice. Just choose the reason below that it makes it hardest for you to implement your curriculum. Again, It's not science, but just want to get your feedback, your personal experience. If you have other, please put something in chat. So expectations of parents, expectations of the curriculum, ability of students to carry out the curriculum, and ability of teachers to implement the curriculum, and other. Just give it a couple of seconds. How are we doing? 53, we're good. Okay, let's see the results of the poll and look at the chat. If there's anything in chat, please feel. Other, not many in other. Ability of student, that's fascinating. Nearly half of you said it's really a mismatch between what the curriculum requires and the ability of the students. This could be coming in from different backgrounds, not having the right level of English, not necessarily understanding how to learn in that particular curriculum, and parents are really difficult. Students, so these are things, this is all the stuff, the comments you're putting in chat are all the things we heard in our research. Okay, so I mean, again, because of time, I'm going to move on, but this is a big one. Implementing it, it just can't necessarily be implemented in the way in which the school, the parents, the students, or the curriculum itself was intended. The last one is just diving a little deeper into that, which is the variation in student and teacher competency. I'm not talking about ability or proficiency, but just maybe the teachers are not trained to deliver a curriculum. Maybe they're language teachers. Maybe they're not trained in literacy for sheltered instruction. It's that kind of thing. Nothing wrong with the teachers. It's the mix between the school, the curriculum, the students, and the teacher. Next slide, please. And I sort of broke this down into a chart with 4 parts. And, you know, where there is high student competency, good English, learner training, and high teacher competency, teachers able to teach the curriculum, the subjects, the students, it's not a problem. They can do it. And little training is needed. Where you have a situation, next please, which I'll call B, where there's high teacher competency, but the students are not up to it, and that's what you showed in the poll just now, it's very hard to implement it. The teacher will adjust tasks and activities. They might refocus on teaching language. They need to be able to do things like learner differentiation, all kinds of things around the language versus the content. This is okay in primary school, even into middle, very hard to do at high school. C is when the students are very competent. Maybe they have high levels of English, or they've been in the private school system for a while, but the teachers, because the teacher supply is difficult, are not necessarily able to deliver the curriculum. Students get bored, and what the teacher does is end up reverting to teaching the book. A lot of training needed in this context. And D is where this is your worst case, where it's simply impossible because the teachers and the students are really not up to the job, and they get demotivated, the parents are unhappy, parents beat up on the teachers and the school, and so on. You see all of these types in those 8,000 international bilingual private schools. It's just, and it's part of the supply. There's strong demand for this education, and the supply of trained teachers able to do it is just limited. Not a teacher problem, it's just a supply and demand problem. Okay, next slide, please. Just a quote. Could you click again?
Oh, sorry.
It's fine. Yeah, just what are the difficulties? This is my last slide. What are the difficulties? Just type in chat. What difficulties is this coordinator talking about? Type in anything. Just, yeah, I know you're reading it. Apologies. Just type in what you think. Abstract concepts, absolutely. Very hard to deal with abstract concepts if you don't have the language. In high school, this is a high school because they're implementing biology. Language is the starting point for every discipline. Context is key. I mean, there's, you know, it's really complex to teach subjects. I mean, I cannot imagine learning mathematics in my second language. I just don't think I have the ability. And to suddenly hope that students can learn enough English to be able to study that kind of thing is largely unrealistic. So that second goal, the teacher-student proficiency piece, it's really the main reason why it's a challenge to implement the curriculum. Okay, next slide, please, Rachel. So what did we learn? We have 3 minutes, but we can cover this fairly rapidly. First thing is, this is a snapshot. really is just a snapshot. We did 67 hours of interviews, we did a survey, we have lots of other conversations. What we're sharing is a snapshot. And we learned that this, spectrum of schools is highly fluid. It's changing all the time. But there are more and more schools in this middle section. In chat, feel free to put what type of school you think yours is. This is how we look at it. Maybe you look at it differently, and that's okay. But this is where we see most of the growth coming. The goals are the same: bilingual English medium education, study overseas, get an advantage through English in the workplace. But the challenges are the same. It's hard to implement that curriculum, even partially in English, if you can't find the teachers and the students are not ready for this. Seeing lots of people putting in bilingual, aspiring bilingual, EMI, it's really good to see. Next, please, Rachel. I think we learned 3 areas where we as a publishing house can help. Yeah, and that's what we are. We're a publisher. I'm not going to pretend the research was independent in the sense that we wanted to just learn. We wanted to see what we could do and how, as a publisher, we can support these schools and these needs. The first one is English is really needed more and more in these growing schools. You cannot implement an international curriculum without the right levels of English, especially if that curriculum is mostly in English. Someone put that in chat. English is the key to being able to acquire the content. Secondly, that our instructional materials actually help. We have an approach to publishing, which we have had for a decade or more, that emphasizes bringing the world to the classroom and the classroom to life. It emphasizes real content, authentic content, but provides a strong scaffolding in English language. And we do it for all types of learners. These materials really provide a great pathway and make the connections into the content areas. We saw this and we heard this again and again in the research. And lastly, that the materials we publish actually have the academic competencies that parents and teachers and students and employers and national governments are looking for. This is deliberate, and this is part of what we do. Next slide, please, Rachel. This one takes a little time.
It's sticking.
It'll change.
Oh, no.
That's just a back one. Just to remind you, we are a publisher. We have materials. In my whole career, this is probably the least promotional webinar we've ever done. You get 10 seconds. Reach out to your local representative, reach out to us through chat, but we do have materials that can help you, and we will continue to publish materials that can help you. Otherwise, we are at time to the minute.
Yeah, and we've run out of time today for questions, but we will be available to answer the questions in a follow-up blog to this webinar. If you do have burning questions that you would like to pose, we would love to hear from you. So please do. We'll send a link out to you, I think, won't we, Emily?
Yep, we will. And people can put them in the Q&A box right now.
Great.
And I responded to a couple of people in QA. We can summarize all the questions and provide answers and send that out on the blog when we send the recording and the certificate of attendance. So I don't know if anyone else has Lou or Emily has a comment, or Rachel, but thank you.
Just really to say thank you so much for joining us today, for being such interactive participants. It's been so interesting to hear that the things we talked about resonated with you, and thank you for sharing your experiences with us.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the fantastic session, Rachel and Ian. And thank you again to everyone who joined us today. And just 2 reminders, immediately after the session, you will be directed to a feedback survey. So please let us know what you thought. And again, we will be sending along a certificate and a recording of the session within 5 business days. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your days.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.